Good evening. I'm Joe Carbonetta, and this is Arroyo Live. This program is produced by and through the facilities of Pasadena Media to help enrich our community through informative and meaningful conversation. You can share your questions or comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. Since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, crimes targeting Asian Americans have risen dramatically. A recent report by Stop AAPI Hate, a group which tracks instances of violence and harassment committed against Asian Americans, verified nearly 3,800 instances of discrimination of one form or another against Asian Americans in the last year. And the actual number is speculated to be much higher, as many such crimes often go unreported or unaddressed. Tonight, in a special edition of Arroyo Live, we have a very special conversation highlighting Asian American and Pacific Islander voices. To help facilitate this important and timely discussion, tonight's program will feature a guest host. Please stay with us for this very special edition of Arroyo Live.
Good evening. I'm Brian Takeda, and I will be your host for this evening's special edition of Arroyo Live. This evening, we have a panel of outstanding community leaders to share their voice and sentiments surrounding the horrendous actions against Asian communities. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Pasadena Councilman Gene Masuda, representing East Pasadena, District 4. Next, we have Mercedes Cook, Los Angeles Deputy Public Defender and board member of the Philippine American Bar Association. Welcome. Also, we have Kira Kang. She's a recording artist and president, CEO of Miss Kira Productions. Also, we have Haipin Im, President and CEO of Faith and Community Empowerment. And finally, we have Arnold Lee, President of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association. Welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
So, what I'd like to do is start off by having you answer a question so that people in the audience will have a better idea of who you are. And so I'd like to ask the question, what do you love about your culture and community? So I guess I'll go for a volunteer. Who'd like to start? Anyone? Okay, Arnold. Arnold raised his hand first. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Arnold Lee. Sorry if I stole this from other folks. That's why I volunteered first. But because of the wide array of flavors, wide array of different textures, and a lot of good home cooking, that's always my number one pick. And never shy to try something new. So I just want to share that about me. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, who'd like to go next? Okay, Gene. Councilman Masuda.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. Like Arnold, I love food. And as you know, in food in Japanese, it's tabemono. I love the Japanese culture, like the history and flower arrangement and the Obon time for dancing. And what I really enjoy and appreciate is the manners that Japanese families teach their children. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, who's next?
I can go next.
All right.
So I guess I'm Filipino and Black. My dad is Black and my mom is Filipino. And I'd say one common characteristic from both sides is our adaptability. I feel like my Filipino side as well as my Black side, we learn to adapt pretty well to any kind of situation that we're confronted with. I feel like from both sides, that's kind of helped shape me to be who I am. And while I do a lot of things afraid, I just assume that I'm going to figure it out because it's in my blood. That's how I was born. So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. All right, down to the final two. Who
I guess
will
I could go. Oh.
All right, Kira.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kira. I'm Korean American, and what I love most about my culture is chong. And in Korean, that's a word that's referring to a feeling of love and affection. It's a little difficult to describe in English, but I could say that it's possibly related to the idea of collective emotion, where we have an understanding that all energetic beings are connected.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And finally, Hapen.
Well, I feel like Arnold and Kara kind of stole some of my thunder, but it's my fault. I waited to the last. Again, name is Hey Pinim, and I think first I thought if sushi, raw fish could get trendy, that Korean food will one day have its day. And so definitely like Korean barbecue and kimchi and everything else has become very popular. So for that, I'm grateful. I think also the Korean drama has really been, I think, are one of our best like PR, like I never thought Korean men would become sexy, at least growing up Asian in this country, right? The way they totally emasculate Asian men. So for all those kind of things, Korean drama. And the last piece, I think faith plays such a significant role in our community. In America, 75% of Koreans are connected to churches. And I see how faith has really helped our people to love others, that at the global level, Korea sends out the greatest number of missionaries after the US, and they help a lot of people in that way. But also faith has been the core of helping in terms of our independence movement, in terms of a lot of the things that we do as people. And so for that, I'm also grateful. And I'm Korean American.
Great. Thank you all for sharing that. I think it's kind of nice to start off our meeting with some good things. But we're here tonight to actually talk about some very serious issues confronting our communities. And so with this in mind, Jean, Councilman Masuda, I'd like to start with you. This week, the city of Pasadena, the city council, adopted a resolution condemning xenophobia, bigotry, and discrimination that have been directed toward Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders throughout history, and condemning the recent attacks on females, elderly, and others of Asian descent. So, what do you think is the importance of cities like Pasadena taking a stand against racism, hatred, and discrimination?
Thank you, Brian. Our council was unanimous on that decision. It's important for city leaders to make a strong statement like the one Pasadena made this past week, their resolution, and letting the community know that racism and hate is unacceptable for anyone committing any kind of violence, racial slurs, hate crimes, and other unacceptable crime against a person or persons.
Yes, right. Anyone else have any thoughts about that? No? Okay.
I just want to add that this past week, I think I've just been really amazed and grateful for the voices. First from our own community, for which the Asian community have been silent. And so for those reasons, or I don't know, maybe the word silent might not be the right word, where we've not had a platform. And in that way that our voices have become more vocal and more visible. And then I am also just floored and gratified by multiple other groups, other ethnic groups have spoken up, but particularly, I think in light of the history of maybe some of the Black Asian tension too, that quite a number of Black leaders, celebrities, and others have really used their platform and gifts to really push back this terrible narrative of blaming the victims and all those things that they have tried to do on the Asian community. So I'm very, very grateful. So I appreciate the Councilman Jean Masuda's work, and it is important that other allies can continue to speak up on this matter.
Right, I agree. I am thankful to Pasadena Media and the city of Pasadena for giving us this platform. I've lived in Pasadena my entire life, and I'm not sure I can remember Asian Americans being given the opportunity to speak out. So I am grateful for that. So thank you very much. Arnold, recent data from Stop AAPI Hate, which is an organization that tracks and responds to incidents of hate, violence, and harassment, child bullying against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. They recently revealed that there were over 3,800 anti-Asian racist incidents reported over the last year. A majority of those crimes were toward elderly and youth. So, what is the cultural significance of these demographics being targeted? And what do you believe has contributed to the increased prevalence of these incidents? And to add on to that, how can other communities support us so that we can put an end to this violence?
Thank you, Brian. And I also want to thank Pasadena Media for giving us, all of us here today, and the AAPI community this platform to talk about this important issue that has been plaguing the AAPI community for several generations, even historically. But this past year has been tremendously heartbreaking for a lot of our community members, a lot of our family members, friends, coworkers, and the like. I think most importantly, as you mentioned, targeting the elderly and the youth, at the very core of it is sickening, it's deplorable. And I think the general significance is that the AAPI community as a whole is being targeted. So when one person or one ethnic group is targeted, no one in the AAPI community is safe. As I mentioned, this is not new. Historically, at least in the history of our nation, there's been the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese American encampment during the World War II, the Vincent Chin incident where he was mistaken as a Japanese American and he was brutally beaten and murdered. And the targeting of the Sikh Americans after the 9/11 incident about 20 years ago. As to where all these, how these all were contributed, I think we've seen last year and frankly, a couple of years even before then, that the dangerous rhetoric that's coming from our highest form of the government, his followers, either on social media or spreading of conspiracy theories, have all definitely played a part. It's dangerous, and as President Biden has mentioned, words do matter. In light of recent events, and even last year, APABA has issued several statements about certain folks exacerbating the rhetoric and perpetuating certain racially charged statements. We have APABA, obviously, can't stand for it. We've even reached out to the state legislature, among with our sister organization, to work together to see how we can put an end to all this violence, harassment, and attack on our community. As to what our community members can do, I think one thing we have seen in the last few years is number one, vote, vote, and vote. Our highest form of government is a place where a lot of things can happen. You can make changes for the positive, or unfortunately, it can go the other way as well. The other method that our community can support, not just the AAPI community, but across the board, is if you do see something, say something. If it's not reported, there's no record of it, nothing can be done. We need to make that effort as community members, regardless of who we are, where we live, or our backgrounds. I think this will be discussed later, but also community intervention. In addition to reporting, there are efforts where it may be appropriate for us as individuals of the community to intervene to the extent that we are able to, and to the extent that it doesn't put our safety at risk. But at the same time, always have to report to the law enforcement agencies or to AAPI hate. It takes more than a village to root out systemic racism against the AAPI community. So it's important for us to work together and root out that racism.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. To follow up on that, Stop AAPI Hate has expressed that it's very likely that there is an underreporting and lack of sufficient data tracking to have accurate numbers on anti-Asian racist incidents. And so any of you, what do you think contributes to underreporting? Would anyone like to address?
I may,
Oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, Arnold. Arnold first. Do you want to go
Okay.
first?
Yeah, go ahead, Arnold.
Sure. So I just actually came from a meeting also talking about this specific issue. A lot of the things circle around, for example, our cultural background, what we've been taught, where we're from, as well as whether or not reporting actually makes a difference. One of the individuals in my last meeting highlighted the fact that as a victim, and her son being a victim, the son didn't want to report it because what difference would it make? And that was heartbreaking because I'm sure that is resonating to a lot of individuals who are victims to these harassments and attacks. So the lack of confidence potentially of our government or to our law enforcement or to our community, I think is a big issue. Some other issues I think have been highlighted, especially recently, I think has been done by Advancing Justice Los Angeles, is cultural barriers, where some of these folks are from, they would feel maybe ashamed, they would feel embarrassed in reporting this, so they're not reporting it. And the consequence of that is, if it's underreported, which I personally believe there is an underreporting, there's going to be a lack of resource, there's going to be a lack of attention, and frankly, we won't be able to get the support that we need. I think one of the things we need to note is how important, for example, as an analogy, how important our census is, because that determines how much funding we get in our specific location or district, and what the legislation would be like. Because all that, to make a difference, we need that data. And without those data, we won't be able to make that change. So I think underreporting is something that is at the core of how we need to address to move forward. And I think it all starts from each of us. And it just I don't want to echo back to what I just mentioned earlier. If you do see something, you have to say something. If you see a victim and they don't report it, you should have the responsibility or be the one to take that responsibility to report it. So it doesn't, so it's not just a faded memory, because a lot of these victims also, at the time that they're either being harassed or attacked, they don't remember it, or they just wanted to don't ever want to talk about it because it potentially is a re-victimization of themselves for reliving that incident. So I just want to call and encourage folks to step up for that.
I think for me, I think our time has arrived in the sense that first there's a language barrier, and as Arnold mentioned, that to report, there's no gratification. A lot of times the bar is so high in terms of a hate crime that, they say, tough luck, and there isn't anything. Maybe they may take reports. And even that I heard, even when someone bothers to report to the police, that is very limited as well. So I think, again, the police response and coverage, I think, is lacking. And thank God for AAPI Hate that they actually started collecting in a way that the community felt comfortable sharing. Because a lot of times I think the other official places, you call into some number, you don't know if, there's no feedback, there's no follow-up. And so it feels like you're just reporting into this black hole. But with at least AAPI Hate, it's being collected, especially just all Asians, and they're reporting it out. And thank God for reporters like Dion Lim, Safai Kim, Nadia Han, at least a few mainstream media reporters, because in the past, it might be covered in ethnic media, but no coverage, no visibility by mainstream media. So I think that is also helping to show visibility and reinforce that actually reporting there could be something as well. I thank God for also social media, that it seems that, yes, the police department, the high bar of hate crime, tough luck, but in the court of social media, there's payback, right? And so I think those are a few things that have actually encouraged more reporting that would have been completely invisible. And I think, again, Stop AAPI Hate has been at the core, but for the rest of the community, I would say there is still, a disconnect because of the language barrier. And honestly, even for me, whatever incidents, whether it's sexist or discrimination, I'm lazy, my life is busy. And for many Asians, they're working so hard, right? To be able to take time to stop and report is painful. And so for all those reasons beyond what Arnold said, I think are very clear facts about why I think that this number shows that 3,800 is really nothing to what it really reflects in the actual pain that's being incurred by the community.
Right.
I would like to add to that. I'd like to encourage everyone to, although it is outside of our culture to report things like this, I would like to highlight that as well as AAPIHate.org has confidential multilingual helplines available. So the reporting can be done in different languages. And they are also providing a bystander training in conjunction with ihollaback.org.
Right, thank you. Thank you for that. I'd like to ask this next question to Mercedes, and then also Kira, if you can also respond. Why is it important to come together and stand in solidarity with movements against unjust treatment and systemic racism against those in the African American community? And also in the fight to address anti-Asian racism, why is it important to work against a narrative that pits one ethnicity against another?
Thank you, Brian. So I think at a very basic level, a very simple answer to why it's important to come together is, frankly, there's just strength in numbers. One person shouting that they've experienced racism or they've experienced discrimination, it reaches what, maybe 1, 2, 3 people, their family members, 2 people, maybe a little bit more. You have 500 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people explaining and telling their story. That gets national attention, that gets media attention. And so I think that's why one of the basic reasons why it's important to stick together. But also we're both, with regards to the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, as well as the Black community, we're fighting the same fight. We're being discriminated in the same ways, maybe not exactly the same ways, but in a way that we share. And if we're fighting the same fight, why not work together? Also, I find it interesting that some people can say that they're against racism as to one particular race, but cannot stand up for racism against another race. I don't understand the connect between that. I think that if you are against racism, you're against racism for every single race because you want equality for everyone, not just for yourself, excuse me, and not just for any particular race. I love when I see during the Black Lives Matter, actually all of 2020 for the most part, during the Black Lives Matter movements, during the protests, seeing my non-Black friends be so supportive of me and vocally, not just, a lot of people sent me messages, but people would post things on their social media. And I found that to be very important because I think there's different levels of respect that we give different people. You respect the people you know more than you would respect a stranger on the street. And so if my white friends are saying, no, Black lives do matter, no, we need to stop AAPI hate, that they will reach a different audience than what I will reach. And that again brings strength in numbers. And then as for your second question, why it's so important to work against a narrative that pits two ethnicities against one another. I think, Hapen, you mentioned this earlier. There is tension between the Asian community and the Black community. It's for decades, probably longer. Growing up, I lived in Gardena, California. It's close to Hawthorne, Compton, Torrance, sort of the South Bay area, but not that close to the beach. And growing up, there were racial tensions. It just recently, I saw someone post something it was a person I went to high school with. And one of the things that person posted was something that hurt me a lot. It said, why should we stand with Asian Americans when they don't stand with us? And I had a visceral reaction to that because I guess exposing myself to different communities has exposed me to different kinds of people, and that's not my experience. It's important to break down these things that I guess we've been told that we should hate each other, that my struggle is more important than your struggle. And just because you're struggling, in this kind of way, if I help you, then that means that I'm lessening the importance of my struggle. I think we really do need to break that down. If we're constantly competing against each other, we're not progressing as fast forward because we're so focused on the issues that are non-issues instead of fighting each other. I really do think that if we work together, recognize that we share a lot of the same concerns, we share a lot of the same pains and a lot of the same traumas, we can move forward much faster and get farther.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Kira, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thank you so much, Mercedes. You bring up so many great points. There is strength in numbers. I do believe that the different marginalized communities need to stand together in solidarity because we are fighting one fight. America is such a melting pot with different cultures, and honestly, no one solution will appease all ethnic groups. So we need to understand that although each community has had their trauma and has had different levels of grief and suffering, we're all fighting for the same goal. We all want to be seen as equal. We all want to be seen as American and worthy of the American dream, regardless of our ethnicity. So pitting one ethnicity against another subscribes to this model minority myth, as if Asian Americans have less of a struggle and that we're all successful and hardworking. And the fact that a model minority myth even exists means that white supremacy exists. We are being pitted against other minority groups as a comparison, as if we're children, like you're doing good, but the others are not. That minimizes our struggles as well. And it creates division between marginalized communities, and it creates a lot of blind ignorance in the rich diversity that exists in our AAPI community. I grew up in the 90s. I grew up marching for Rodney King. So back then, my father ran a smog check shop in Koreatown, and it was completely obliterated after the riots. And we still marched for Black rights. Because even with our personal losses, we understood back then that this is one fight, and it's always been one fight. And I want to make that as loud and clear as possible, that in 2021, we are still fighting this same fight.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Moving on, Hapen, COVID-19 has brought on a slew of challenges within all of our communities, and it's disproportionately affected the AAPI communities. What are some of the effects that you believe COVID-19 has had on on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? And how do you think children are impacted, and how can we continue to help our elders?
It's kind of nice to be told that Asian Americans are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 on a mainstream platform, because that's usually not what is shared. There's a lot of information about the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown lives. But I would say, again, for Asians, even though it is true, no one lifts them up. And so I just want to highlight some points. First of all, because of the Kung flu and China flu references, that for a lot of businesses, whether it was Chinese or other businesses, including Korean community, people stopped visiting these restaurants because people were afraid that they would contract coronavirus, right? And so a lot of businesses just started hurting. And for many of the Asian community, because there's a high language barrier, many of the workers from the community work in these ethnic-owned businesses. So small business closures means also unemployment. So in New York, when it was the epicenter, at that time, during, I think, February to April period, the unemployment increased by 10,000% compared to the next group, which was about 3,000. And then I believe for the African-American community, it was about 2,000%. And even as late as January of 2021, it was still at 500%. The next group was 300. So in terms of unemployment, in terms of small business closures, over 200,000 closed immediately in that February-April period. I have yet to see what the latest, but I know that businesses all around me have closed. And from the dry cleaner business, where 40% of all dry cleaner business are Asian owned, basically majority of them, I think it was 9 out of 10 owners stopped receiving anything. And I think at least 50% are paying their workers out of their savings. So this is just one example. But also the fact that Asians are in the front line and essential businesses. So 1 out of 4 of Asians are in these businesses, right? And 20% of all doctors and surgeons in this country are Asians. So they're literally right there, again, at the epicenter of coronavirus and the epidemic. 10% are nurses in this country, again, are Asian. So and then finally, the anti-Asian racism, right? Pew Research did a study, and at all groups, say who was most impacted by racism through the coronavirus. Every group said Asians, every group. And yet, in terms of receiving investments and initiatives on racial equity, COVID-19, I have yet to hear one single whatever initiative that is targeting the Asian community, even though there's been this disproportionate impact. In LA County alone, in May 2020, Asians had the highest death rate from coronavirus. And even to this day, Pacific Islanders still have the highest infection rate of any group. And so again, for all those reasons, I think that our voices, our pain keeps being erased because of the model minority myth. And our platform, we don't have allies or voices to keep elevating that level. How do you think the children are impacted? First of all, COVID-19, I think there's more growing data that shows that children are also being impacted by the coronavirus, but children growing up in poverty, period. And then being faced with this constant anti-Asian racism. For the first time in this country, I remember telling my husband, be careful who happens to be Asian. In spite of the LA riots and all those other horrific things that I encountered as an Asian in this country, this is the first time. And so for us, I think whether the children telling their parents, mommy, daddy, what should I do? Are you going to come back? And like all those kind of conversations that I see my friends posting on their social media, this has been traumatic. And then finally on our elders, again, I think in the Asian community, especially, I mean, all communities respect their elders, but especially in the Asian culture. And for our parents who have sacrificed so much for their children in coming to this country, for their lives to be at stake and to be punched and pushed and slammed down and knifed. And I mean, it is just horrific that we live in fear, that so many of us are now like walking because the government is not responding, the police is not responding, that our own people would have to go and provide escort services, for our elders. I think it's so wrong in this country as well.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other thoughts on this? Okay. If not, I'd like to go to the next topic. And I'd like Jean, if you could address this. There have been many discriminatory practices and actions against minority populations in California. And we'd like to focus on those actions that targeted Japanese Americans. And just a little bit of background history. In 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law, targeting Japanese who were perceived as a threat by some in the agricultural industry. And then 7 years later, in 1920, California prohibited any Japanese from purchasing land. And then fast forward to February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that led to the imprisonment of 120,000 Japanese Americans across 10 concentration camps, 2 of which were in California, in Manzanar and Tule Lake. The result was 120,000 Japanese who were left homeless. And just last year, this is 78 years later, California issued a formal apology for forcing the 120,000 Japanese. And by the way, 70% of those Japanese were American citizens, okay, out of their homes and imprisonment just because they were Japanese. So, this is significant. Why is it significant to you? And, what can we do to work together so that this will never happen again?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for bringing it up. And you and I know a lot about this subject. My parents, my father's side, they were in Manzanar. My mother's side, they were in Tule Lake. So when you said 70% of these internees were citizens of the United States, that is just astounding. Every time I hear something like that, it's just too amazing for me. But let's get to the apology. I mean, it took 78 years, but I think that the apology was really a wonderful thing. but it was late, you know. And the reason why I say that because the my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation weren't here to hear those words.
Right.
I really believe that the internment camps should never happen again. And that's why when after 9/11, the Japanese community supported the Muslims and to make sure that that kind of thing will never happen again. I can't guarantee it, but it's kind of a reminder that you can't use 9/11 as an excuse because we know what happened after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Thank you, Brian.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, it affected my family also directly. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. You know, and another important bit of history, Arnold, this is for you, and you touched on it earlier. And this is the story about Vincent Chin. So, you know, Vincent Chin lived in Detroit. The evening of his bachelor party, right, he was attacked by two Caucasian men, okay, thinking as an attack on Japanese car makers, right? Vincent Chin was Chinese. And, you know, these two men beat him to death. And here's the thing, you know, these murderers received 3 years probation, no jail time, and were only charged $3,700 in fines. And to top it off, the judge said, these men are not going to go out and harm somebody else. He also said, I just don't think that putting them in prison would do any good for them or for society. And he continued, you don't make the punishment fit the crime. You make the punishment fit the criminal. Two white Caucasian males. So, you know, Arnold, why is it important that we tell these stories?
Thank you, Brian. I think this story, at least like Kira, I grew up in the 90s. This wasn't in our textbooks. This wasn't something we learned about growing up. And interestingly, too, this happened in the 80s, so it wasn't even that long ago. The underlying incident is tragic. It was heartbreaking and a sense of anger. But that anger was amplified by what happened during the criminal justice system. I think it just goes to show, at least to a minimum, the times and the disparity of what happened back then, as well as a lot of questions in my head as to why, what happened, and is this fair? What's going on? People lose faith in the criminal justice system. They lose faith in our government, and we just don't know what to do. But I think what we have to learn from this also is that crimes like this and all the other incidents that's been occurring, as well as over the last decade or two, they are not just statistics. We are not just numbers, because behind every set of data, there's a myriad of stories impacting every single person affected. And without hearing these stories, it's too easy to gloss over the issues, because all you're hearing is one person got attacked, he died, and that's it. It's not putting into perspective. It's not, so quote unquote, teaching a lesson or learning a valuable lesson. So these stories put everything into context. It humanizes these incidents instead of just glossing it over. And I just want to highlight, even just 2021 alone, we've seen so many attacks against the AAPI community, including the deadly attack on the 84-year-old Asian man in San Francisco. And then there was a forceful pushing of a 91-year-old Asian gentleman in Oakland's Chinatown. And I believe that was the one that was captured on video. The assault of a victim waiting for a bus in Rosemead, where the attacker basically took the victim's cane and started striking him. Rosemead, our own backyards. And the attack on the Air Force veteran in our LA Koreatown, who was berated with racial slurs. And of course, last week, the deadly shooting of 6 women of Asian American descent in Georgia. Again, these are not just statistics. We need to tell the story. We need to learn from this and not gloss over the issue. And it's absolutely abhorrent to have this happen time and time and time again. That's why we need to continue to tell these stories and be their voice.
Right,
I want
thank
to
you.
add, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Hapen.
I just want to add that color of justice is not the same. And I think that, again, when we share these stories, I think it lifts up that we have a common enemy, that particularly communities of color, immigrant communities, that justice is not dealt fairly. When I read and heard your comment of the justice saying the punishment should fit the criminal, it reminded me as a woman, particularly because the Atlanta massacre was actually hitting women. And they were trying to blame again the women, the victims. But I remember recently, what was this? A Stanford student that raped a woman. I think she happened to be Asian. And basically, the justice said, "Oh, he has such a bright future, and so really we shouldn't hurt him," or something in that vein, being total disregard for the impact of what this has done on the victim itself. And again, I think in this country where there is Black lives, brown lives, but actually even yellow lives have very little value. And I think these stories will help create solidarity, which again, I think earlier everyone said more voices, right? A unified voice. I think it's so critical. And also this model minority myth that again pits our community against one another, but also certain narratives that I think are really critical, that we combat those narratives that put each other into these categories of evil. And so then there is that lack of trust. And I think also Mercedes' comment earlier about Oppression Olympics. I think when you are about fighting racism and you do it only for one community and discount the pains of others, then I think that it really takes away the moral authority upon which you're fighting justice for your own community, right? And so I think really it's hypocrisy, it's lack of integrity, all those things. And again, bottom line, we have so much to gain by unifying our voices, right? Uniting and being in solidarity. So I just want to put that also out there.
Oh no, that leads to, we only have a few minutes left. Unfortunately, time goes by so fast, but that segues very well into this next topic. And the Asian community is represented by over 50 different cultures, right? And we're talking about communities that speak different languages, different levels of English proficiency, different histories, different immigration patterns, first generation, second generation, culture, communities that have attended college, first time college students and so forth. So we're very diverse. The Asian community is very diverse. So I want to put this out to Kira. What is the importance for all of these communities to stand together while we still embrace our rich diversity? And how does it make you feel? And what do you want people to know about the diversity of the Asian American community and your own experience as an Asian in LA?
Mm-hmm. I always felt like Asian was such a blanketed term. There's so much blind ignorance out there. And I think I have to remind folks that we're talking about an entire continent here. And people seem to forget that. And every, culture and ethnicity is so different. Like you had mentioned, we have different languages, we have different traditions and different struggles. Although we do share a lot of similarities, we also share a lot of differences. And so we do need to stand together in the rich diversity. We need to stand together in solidarity with other marginalized communities and fight this fight together. And I think right now is the time to embrace that rich heritage and share these stories on social media. Share the stories of our immigration, share the stories of our injustices and the discrimination that we've encountered throughout our lives, because it goes by unspoken. And there's a lot that goes by unsaid. And so right now is the movement. I think it's the movement for this generation to spread this information on social media. And I do know a lot of social media accounts that have begun to do that, like Korean archives and things like that, which I see slowly happening. And I think that's wonderful. To speak to my personal experience as an Asian American, I would say it was pretty confusing my entire life. And I think many Asian Americans can probably relate to this confusion, because although we're 23 million strong in this country, many of us try to identify with other races, or we go through phases where we try to identify with other races because we lack a sense of belonging in this country. We don't quite belong to the motherland, but our own country treats us as foreigners. So it leaves us in this really unfortunate gray area, and it creates a lot of racial trauma. I think it's time to raise the awareness that 23 million of us exist and that we are all different and we have a myriad of life experiences, and the media portrays us to be all the same. And I think right now is time to clarify that we are not all the same.
Right. Thank you. I think we're coming down to our last question and wrap up. I kind of want to bundle that all together and pose this to Mercedes. What would you like people outside the AAPI community to know about how they can stand in solidarity and spread awareness about these issues? And why is it important for AAPI communities to receive the help and support from other communities?
So I'll make this short as short as I can, as short as a lawyer can make it. Arnold was talking about this earlier. There are people who feel empowered to be bigots, to be racists, to be sexist. We need to empower the communities who feel like they don't have a voice, or who feel like they don't have a platform, who feel like people aren't listening. And that's where other communities can come and support the AAPI community, because it's hard to constantly go through a struggle day in and day out and feel like you haven't been heard, and to constantly go through struggles and traumas and be gaslit constantly. And then you start to think that maybe it's me, maybe I'm doing something wrong. This is why I shouldn't report. This is why I shouldn't share my story, because no one cares. You need someone else sometimes from the outside to look in and say, hey, no, you deserve your story to be heard. You deserve the respect. You deserve the attention. You deserve the help. And I think that other communities can do that for the AAPI community, especially during this time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do here is just wrap things up by asking for a call to action. And I want to highlight 3 organizations who are helping us fight this battle. One is the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles office. They can be found at advancingjustice la.org. Also, the website stopaapihate.org. And also Hollaback. That's IHOLLABACK.org for bystander intervention training. So all of these websites, all of these organizations are resources. If you need help, you can get help from these organizations. If you see a crime or if you are a victim of a crime, please report it. We need to let people know. We need to, in order to get help, please reach out to these organizations. It's so critical. You know, as we all know, Asian Americans, Asians are inherently quiet. You know, we don't like to make trouble. You know, we don't want to burden anybody. But you know, that time is up. And I feel that we really need to speak out and get help and stand in solidarity with everyone so we can fight this ugly racism. So with that, I'd like to really thank all of you for joining us tonight. The fight that you're putting out there to defeat this racism and, you know, build a stronger and better community for ourselves, our parents, and our children. So thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you being here.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.